All right, sounds good. So there will probably be more people joining us. So thank you for all of you who are participating. We are going to record this so that it'll be available for families later. So if you're not able to see all of tonight's webinar, then certainly you'll be able to view it later, and we'll send out a message with the information on how to access those webinars as we go forward. So we're just going to launch right in today, and we're going to do some introductions so that you know who each one of us are, and then we'll kind of dive right in. So Fred, you want to start?
Sure. Good evening and welcome. I see we have some teachers in the audience this evening, as well as parents and community members. So welcome to all of you. My name is Fred Rundle. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Learning Services for the school district. I'm in my 12th year in our district, having served as a principal at Lake Ridge Elementary and now in the district office. So it's great to be here tonight to kick off this first of several webinars, and want to thank Nova and Hannah and Beth, who you're going to meet, for coming alongside and really orchestrating these events. We're hoping that they're going to be very beneficial for our community as they learn about our past, our present, and our future with regard to how we're supporting students with dyslexia.
Thanks, Fred. I'm Nova Williams. I'm the Assistant Director of Learning Services, and I have been in the district 13 years. That's one longer year than Frederick Rundle. However, I started my career in Mercer Island as a teacher, and then as an intern, and then now in my current job. So excited to get started on this work together and start letting families know all of the work we've been doing and the work we'll plan to continue doing. I think there are some really great and exciting things to look forward to in Mercer Island. Beth, you want to introduce yourself?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Beth DeGrace. I'm Assistant Director of Special Services. And like Fred said, I'm here alongside the Learning Services team in this work. So I'm honored to be here tonight and excited for the work.
I'm not sure that Hannah is in space right now to introduce herself. So we'll introduce, Beth, do you want to introduce Hannah?
Yeah. Hannah Bolivar is another Assistant Director of Special Services. She and I work very closely together, and we both will be partnering with Nova and Fred in this work. So
perfect. Thanks. So thinking a little bit about the purpose as to why we're doing this series of webinars, you'll learn more about the upcoming webinars toward the end of the presentation tonight. But we started these series of webinars because we learned a lot in the pandemic about how we can communicate better with families. And one of those things I think is that we can host these sort of, in the spring they were called fireside chats, courtesy of Dr. Rundle there. And now we're sort of hosting these webinars. A lot of that is to communicate to you what's going on in the district and how we're navigating some of the changes in the law, as well as how we're navigating some of the things in our own system and what we're doing that's really exciting, what our teachers are doing that's really exciting. We'll hope that this builds some support and connection between families. Obviously, we want to be transparent with all of you and make sure that you're all aware of the things that we're doing. And a big part of this is to support a resource for families. So the webinars are really just one part of getting those resources together. There'll be a resource page that'll be available to families that will help support families at home when they're reading with their child or seeking out resources just to help understand what's going on with their child. And so our goal is to just try to help support families a bit more than we already are.
So there's one other introduction tonight. We wanted you to meet Devin. As you can see, Devin is a pretty rambunctious young lad. He is quite inquisitive. He's quite curious. He's quite persistent when it comes to everything except for school. You can see that he probably, actually this was his first day snowboarding up on the hill, and he was already in action. The bigger the jump, the better for Devin when he is out and about, and the perseverance.
Oh, Fred, you got muted somehow.
Yep, now I'm back. If you'll do one click, Nova.
Yep.
Something else to know about Devin: he's 10 years old. He's in 4th grade, intellectually functioning at the last assessment, at the 88th percentile, quite able as a thinker and a participant. But you can see that his reading and writing shows a much different picture. In fact, his oral reading is at the 8th percentile. And I raise all of these and bring these forward tonight because if I could have convinced him to come in here tonight and introduce him in person, I would have. This is my son. I have 3 children. I have a high schooler, a middle schooler, and an elementary student. And this is my elementary son who has dyslexia. And so the work that we're doing is not only professional, but it's personal. And the 4 of us on the call tonight, we all have our own kids at home. And whether or not you have kids or not does not make you a great educator or not. But at least for us, there is some personal connection. And I think it's important that the community knows that some of the struggles that their children are facing are ones that our children face as well. And so Devin takes a different approach to learning, and we have to have a different approach to teaching. And we learn a lot as parents along the way. And we're hoping you come along for that journey for you and your children. So one of the things as we're engaging in any of our work is we're trying to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, we have a strong commitment in our district in thinking about these 3 areas as we use it as a lens as we're approaching our work. And we've also been using this other diagram, which is called the Quantum 10. Put together by Dr. Sullivan. And it's kind of a recent look, and it's helped us all the way through this pandemic in thinking about teaching and learning, but I think it's going to propel us going forward because as you can see, this is all about how do we give students access, how do we engage them, how can we give them opportunities, and then how do we measure success? And then all the way around the outside are the different ways that we can approach this, and each one of them plays an important part in equity. And so whether or not it's universal design for learning, something as simple as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or thinking about response to intervention, there's many ways that we can approach this. And tonight we're going to be talking to you about our journey going back almost a decade in our school district when we first really started to explore ways that we can help our learners, particularly those with dyslexia. So anchoring ourselves, we think about our values of not just the bottom bullet, which is providing rigorous and challenging learning, but balancing that with the whole child, ensuring that our classrooms and our schools, as well as our buses and other activities are inclusive and equitable. And then of course, making sure that we're safe and supportive. And so if students are going to be the priority, we have to come together as a staff, work together as a team, and continuing to use these as our lenses. And so we always like to come back to this to anchor our thinking, just as we do in our equity work. So going back, and this takes me back to when I was principal at Lake Ridge, we had started a group. It was called Struggling Students Group. It was formed of parents, administrators, teachers, interventionists, and others. And what we were really curious about is taking a look at the students who certainly were capable and certainly were high functioning, and yet the barrier for them to their access to the gen ed environment was really something that was getting in the way of either their perceptual ability to perceive language, whether or not they were then encoding or decoding. And so it began as a movement about struggling students. And over the course of about 6 months after we looked at that, we decided, let's not look at this as deficits. Struggling students was certainly a deficit model. Let's move into and think about these learners as different. And it doesn't make them behind. It doesn't make them ahead. They just learn differently. And so through some community forums and others, we embarked on a comprehensive review in the spring of 2013. It was led by a practitioner, Dr. Marcy Stein from the University of Washington, Tacoma, Bill Rasplica, who at the time was at the Franklin Pierce School District, and our Puget Sound Educational Service District. And they produced a report after a series of interviews and on-site forums. They also did document reviews and others, and they really helped us to think about ways that we might be able to better support our learners. That then turned into a different learners committee, and this was a committee of parents and teachers and administrators who continued to meet to think about the report and how it's being implemented. And then eventually it led to our Learning Services Advisory Committee. The report itself had three broad findings or areas that we'd like to go into in a little greater detail tonight. The first was screening and progress monitoring. And so at the time, there was a recommendation that we needed to screen and progress monitor, especially in a more comprehensive and universal way, beginning with our youngest learners. The second piece was to starting our multi-tiered systems of support and continue to think about what are the many tiers. So it wasn't just either special education or general education, but what were some of the attributes or aspects in between. And then finally, how are we using data to drive our decisions? Whether or not those were curriculum purchases, whether or not those were thinking about students and the supports they need, but those. And so since that report, we've been putting many of these into place and continuing to evolve as a system. Nova, is this you?
It is. I was trying to navigate something.
Sorry.
That's all right. So as the different learners, we kind of go through each of these recommendations, the screening and progress monitoring. So we've made a couple changes and modifications along the way, of course, as anyone would do, as we are making our best effort to improve the system. So as one of the recommendations that Fred alluded to there is that we should be screening students in K-6 and that we should be progress monitoring any students who are flagged below level as identified by the district. So in 2014, around thereabouts, we implemented our first iteration of Ames Web screening and progress monitoring tools. And so there was training, there were parameters around sort of who to progress monitor after we've screened all of our students. And we've developed matrices that have been modified several times since then to identify which assessments would be given to which grade levels of students. So we actually have quite a robust set of assessments that are given to our kids, which is something that'll help us a great deal as we look forward to implementing any additional things that we need to do in order to cover the legislation around dyslexia. So we're in a really good space in Mercer Island because of that. And in 2017, we actually rolled out the newest iteration of Ames Web, which is referred to as Ames Web Plus. And Ames Web Plus, it has some different assessments, so that sparked a little bit of a change in some of our matrices, which we then changed again to after we realized that some of the assessments weren't quite what we wanted. So we've done a couple changes along the way. And for those of the parents who are out there who have students in the system who have seen their assessment reports, you have likely seen that some of those assessment names change. Now that could either be because of the grade level of the student or because we've modified the assessment to get the right data for our students in order to make sure that we're identifying the correct grouping of kids who might need additional support. So when we think about MTSS, that's a big lift that encompasses lots and lots of different things. The Tier 1 curriculum adoptions that we've done have been fairly robust over the years, and it feels a bit like we've had a little bit of time to breathe over that in these last couple of years. I know Fred can appreciate that. So in 2014-15, we embarked on our first adoption of Mondo's Bookshop Common Core. That's our core reading program in our K-5 system. And that encompasses reading, phonics, and oral language. It's not atypical for a program to have reading and phonics, but it is less common for a program to have oral language. And that's one of the things we really loved about it. When we think about our dyslexic learners, the challenge that sometimes students with dyslexia have is that they don't have oral language problems in retaining that. So it does help us differentiate between the students who are struggling with language, period, versus the students who are struggling with the decoding elements of language and not necessarily the language comprehension part of their brain. In 2017-18, the second part of that was to adopt a writing program, which we've sort of long known has been something that was coming our way. And we adopted being a writer. We adopted the 3 parts of that program, which are the writing program, the grammar program, and the spelling program. The spelling program begins in 1st grade and not kindergarten, because in kindergarten there are different expectations. So there are some differences in there, but we have a great deal of robust curriculum that I think has helped set up things for the kids to have, and the teachers really to help support our kids. So the next bit of it under MTSS is to really think about our programs or our special services that we have and how can we modify those to make them better. So one of the things that we've done over the last several years is that we have unified our curriculum in our learning support program. Prior to that point, they were using iterations of what our gen ed teachers were using, and they still are. But we identified that we needed some additional material. So they adopted a program called Really Great Reading, which aligns nearly perfectly with what we're doing in our Mondo curriculum with some, alterations to things. So that is a foundational material, very similar to what we would see for kids in our tier 1, our general ed classrooms. And so if students need that additional support, then it reinforces their tier 1 learning. Fred, do you want to talk about the disbanding of the ELL magnets since you were the head keys?
Yes. So one example of thinking about how we want to make sure we're supporting students in their, as close to their home schools, and also think about including all learners. When I arrived in the district some number of years ago, at that time, our English language, or students acquiring English as a second language or English language learners, ELL, it was a relatively small number of students. And the original thinking was that students who qualified for this particular set of services would all go to Island Park Elementary, where we would provide center-based kind of supports. As the number of students grew and we started thinking about the equity and inclusiveness of all learners, we made a decision to move away from a center-based model or a magnet model and begin to offer services in all 4 schools. So it became less about a program and more about the services that those students would need. And so we continue to think about this as now and as we move forward in the future, as we contemplate all of what have become programs and think more about services. And so while we haven't completely evolved in all areas, it's an example of how we're continuing to think about systems and providing services rather than programs.
Thank you. Some of the other things that we've done, we've reviewed specialized programs. So both highly capable programs and the special education program underwent a review with recommendations that came out of that. And the high cap, I'm not sure if there are any participants in the audience, but they do have a committee that's working on some of those recommendations throughout this year and have been over the last couple of years. As Fred mentioned, we're looking at services versus programs. So that's kind of our main goal there. The other things that we did, again, this is previous, this is before this year, is when we adopted our materials, we provided intervention tools and supports to teachers as well. So for example, we purchased phonics tile boards, we purchased phonics cards, we purchased phoneme grapheme cards and other curricular resources. So these were all intended to be tools that would help support the work that the teachers were doing. And so it wasn't just an adoption of the materials, there was professional learning associated with it and additional resources purchased to help support teachers in the implementation of our new curriculum that we had purchased. Data-based decision-making. So this speaks back to that progress monitoring and screening tool that we talked about. So there was initial training. We have since done additional training on the new system. And there are tools and resources available in that system. Aside from that, we've offered periodic professional learning around that. They've done a lot of PLC work in the teacher teams on data and making database decisions and making data growth goals. Each of the buildings at the elementary level has they have RTI teams or some iteration of that in which they're examining data and making decisions for the school as well. So a lot of those teams have input on the SIP plans for each of the buildings. And then ongoing, of course, you'll learn more here shortly about what we are planning and what we are currently engaged in.
And just a couple of acronym updates or whatnot. A PLC is a professional learning community, which is a term that we use for to describe bringing together educators to really problem solve around a common problem of practice that they are trying to figure out, whether or not that's related to a particular discrete skill or potentially planning for larger units, but it's really about professional collaboration.
Thanks. So as many of you know, and probably why many of you are here, is that the state passed legislation around screening for dyslexia in 2018. So in fact, at that time, Lindsay Majatich, our former director of student services, was in the learning services team, and she and I were monitoring that pretty closely in terms of what the progress was there. In March of 2018, Governor Inslee signed it into law. And then by August of 2018, the Dyslexia Advisory Council started to meet. Mercer Island has had representation on that. I, as a learning services member, applied and was accepted to be a participant in that committee and have been participating in that work since inception. In the 2018 to 19 school year, the Dyslexia Advisory Committee accepted recommended screener applications. And to be clear about the recommended screeners, what the state's job in all of this really was to do for the DAC is to basically review any assessment companies that applied and make determinations if they fit the qualifications for the state to place them on a recommended screener list. Washington State is a local control state, and what that really means is that the school district has a lot of control over how they manage things and what they choose. So the state doesn't come in and tell people, you have to use this assessment, you have to use this assessment. Instead, they provide recommendations and they provide guidance about the parameters around those assessments that must be used. So the Dyslexia Advisory Committee went through lots of iterations of applications and reviewed those with rubrics and landed on some, and then did it again last year with new applicants as well. And then in 2019 to 2020, the Dyslexia Advisory Council put together development of resources for school districts. And those resources are fairly basic and robust in nature. There are a lot of the things that school districts are already working on, like multi-tiered systems of support to help support kids, how to support English language learners in this process and differentiate between language-based disabilities and language-based acquisition challenges. So there have been some resources developed for that to help support districts. In 2021, we have only met once so far by nature of what's occurred this school year, and that has been virtual. And we're continuing to refine those resources that have been developed, and will continue to do so, and may add more to our plate dependent. In 2021 and 2022, that's the expected implementation year of this particular bill. There has been conversation amongst people asking about it and whether or not they're going to delay that. And that's really out of our control and out of OSPI's control. It's more about the legislators and whether or not they choose to do that. So at this point, I believe it will still be the plan, and we will still be prepared in fall of 2021 to engage in this screening. So to understand what the bill basically says, first, the bill is focused on K2 students. It's not focused beyond that. Initially, when some of the drafts came out, the drafts cited later grades, but the focus is really on K2 students in the final bill. The final bill basically says that we would be screening students for symptoms and indicators of dyslexia. It doesn't necessarily say that we're going to confirm that they do or do not have dyslexia through these screening tools. That's not really the purpose of these screening tools. The screening tools that we use evaluate discrete reading skills, but they are a singular data point. So we would never want to make a decision about a student and their capabilities based on a singular data point, even if it's several data points within the same tool. So it does give us enough information to be able to make some determinations instructionally, but we don't necessarily embark on diagnosing the kids as a part of this process. We'll implement some of our research-based interventions using our MTSS model, and you'll learn more about how we've worked with teachers to help develop some of those strategies. It does require monitoring of progress, which is something we already do as we monitor progress in both AIMSweb and then as well in our curriculum. It requires that families are informed of the progress, that families are really kept informed in general, which would be the hope for anything. And that if we get to a place where things are not functioning as they should, that we would consider evaluations or other interventions. So I want to be really clear that the bill isn't saying that we're going to qualify students for special education or give them IEPs. The purpose is for us as a school system to further identify students and make sure that we're supporting kids in the right way with the right tools to make progress. That's the goal. If that means in the general education classroom that they're supported just fine, perfect. If it means that they need additional supports and interventions in the general ed classroom and LSP, then perfect. If they do get to a place where they need an IEP, then that is what they need. So the goal is really to help support kids. That's the point and the impetus of this bill. So what's been our response to that? As I said, we were monitoring pretty closely what 6162 was going to do, because obviously it has big implications for a district, and planning would need to commence. So we can't just turn it around quickly and make sure that everybody knows what they need to do with this. We need to really invest in some training and some tools to help support teachers and kids. So in March 2018, it was signed into law, and in 2018-19, that school year, we started developing the plan and purchasing some of our resources to help launch our plan. In 1920, our first cohort of teachers were trained in LETTERS. LETTERS stands for Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling. It is a professional development program, not a curriculum. The teachers who were trained in this were all of our kindergarten teachers, our LSP teachers, our ELL teachers, our coaches, and our resource room teachers, all at the elementary level. We had additional trainers trained, so we sent 3 additional folks off to get trained nationally so that they could become local trainers as well, to build our capacity in training and also build our coaching capacity. It's important that you have the people with the knowledge, the depth of knowledge to be able to help teacher teams along this pathway together. And then we also evaluated assessment. So around that same time as after we had moved over to AIMSweb Plus, and that was part of this process, was ensuring that we had the right assessment. So we've finalized our matrices to that degree to be able to make sure that we have the right assessments for our kiddos. And we began planning the protocols that would be put in place for that and testing some of those out. In 2021, this school year, cohort 1, that group of kindergarten, LSP, ELL coaches, and resource room teachers have continued their learning. So we have had 1 session with them, and that session focused largely on assessment and continued strategies instruction. We added some additional information about dyslexia and layering that in with them. And then cohort two of teachers started as well. So that's this year. We have our 1st and 2nd grade teachers, as well as any new staff. So as some of you may know, we've added kindergarten and 1st grade staff to accommodate some of our social distancing and ensure that we have the lowest class sizes to be able to accommodate return to school. So we have trained some additional staff as well, so that they are learning this, even if it doesn't mean that this is the job that they are doing going forward, they have this knowledge to support kids this year. We're continuing the assessment protocol planning, developing the webinar series that you're participating in this evening, and then also developing family resources available to families. When the expected implementation year hits next year, we will have continued LETTERS training for our staff, and we'll have continued cohort 2 training, which will delve more deeply into instructional practice and dyslexia and assessment. And then we'll have continued PD for the staff as a whole. So once a student's identified and we've been supporting them, we want to ensure growth. But, second grade doesn't mean everything is all better and we're good to go. So that really means informing as we get there our intermediate teachers as well as to how they would help support these kiddos in their intervention groups, which they do already have set up to be able to help support them. So what is LETRS training? The first year that the teachers are engaged in, they're working through the series of professional learning units, and those are units 1 through 4. LETRS as a whole has 8 units. We are covering the first 4 because that's about the foundations of the skills to learn to read. So unit 1 is the challenge of learning to read, in that the teachers learn a lot more about the brain and how the brain is processing language and text on pages as we learn to read. And so that's really focused on any areas of challenge that a student might experience, dyslexia and otherwise. Unit 2 is the speech sounds of English, and that is all speech-based, not grapheme-based, meaning that we're focused on the sounds of the English language and how those can be confused for kids without the actual letter itself on a page. Just the sounds themselves can be confusing for kiddos. Unit 3, teaching beginning phonics, word recognition, and spelling. And then Unit 4 goes into the advanced elements of that. So those final 2 units are really instructional set strategy based. There's lots of supports. There are some assessments built into that system that permit teacher use after they've been trained. And so they're welcome to use those for anything that they feel fit. And I know some of our last cohort teachers were using the phonological assessment screening test as part of their toolkit when they were trying to determine how to best support kids. As a part of our LETRS rollout, we have developed these literacy materials kits. So we recognize that there were additional things that would be necessary to help support our teachers and kids as we rolled this out. So we added those things into the mix of what we already had, and then we also beefed up some of the things that some folks didn't have. So for example, some of our resource room teachers didn't have the same resources that our general education teachers did, so we provided them to them. So one of the things that we provided to them are Kidlips. Kidlips is a very basic program, and it's super easy to implement. And what it does is it helps students with any articulation errors or phoneme challenges that they might have, to sort of weed that away as a thing that might be in the path of their learning to read. We gave them syllaboards. Syllaboards are, as they work through syllables, could really be used for anything because they're just mini whiteboards basically. We gave them phoneme grapheme cards. We gave them a teacher set and then also a kid set. Excuse me. The teacher set talks about all of the spelling patterns of English and why those things are the way that they are, and that really helps deepen the knowledge for our teachers. We also gave our teachers the Haggerty Phonemic Awareness Curriculum. It is called curriculum. It's a pretty loosely phrased term because it's not really curriculum per se. What it really is practice for kids. So teachers take about 10 minutes a day, if that, really running through these auditory experiences of phonemic awareness so that students can just practice those skills. What we know about those skills is that they are built on one another. So students have to learn to be automatic with them to become automatic readers later on. And so that material teachers have really loved. And even in the era of COVID and remote learning, I know that some of our teachers have done really amazing jobs trying to invest their time in putting that in the learning still. We've given them things like felt pieces and magnetic wands and chips, which to someone who doesn't teach reading might not make a whole lot of sense, but those are more of the sensory types of tools that we would use for students as we try to layer in that additional practice for any students who might be experiencing challenge. It's important to say that, what is good for a student who has dyslexia is good for all kids. So all of these things are good for all kids. It's about frequent distributed practice for the kids who need more. And so we are working through that as we work through the trainings with our teachers. Fred, I've been talking a while. Did you want to add anything?
No, you were doing great.
Thanks. So letters year 2. So in the first year, we cover that content, units 1 through 4. And as we cover that content 1 through 4, we don't add in a whole lot. We do add in some additional information about dyslexia and help teachers really understand that a bit more. We talk about what the reading brain looks like for a typically developing student and what the reading brain looks like for a student with dyslexia. And so we try to add those things, infuse those things in along the way. But it's a pretty heavy year of content. And I know our teachers can speak to that, and they were troopers and invested and they loved it, but it's not easy work. So in year 2, what we're really doing is sort of taking it back, and we're thinking about helping teachers understand dyslexia, thinking about that practical data evaluation work that they do on a daily basis as they look at those assessments and progress monitors, how to deep dive into that and make sure that they're identifying what skills a student might have a deficit in or might need additional support in, and then that reinforced strategy work. So we teach them a lot of strategies. We cover a lot of strategies in that first year of letters, more than any one person could absorb in a single year. So we return to some of that. And then there's a lot of time for them to be able to share some of the great things they're doing and how they're using the tools and resources that they've been given to improve student learning.
Nova, I'll add in here, just reviewing some of the comments and some great questions and commentary in the chat. I think a couple of things just to add in to reinforce what you had said earlier around letters not necessarily being a curriculum. We know that curricula and programs don't teach students, our teachers do, and that's why when we chose letters, we intentionally chose it because of its commitment to professional development and professional learning around the language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling. So it was intentionally picked out because it was going to provide that backbone of experience. Educators coming into the profession or those who have been in it for many years have a variety of experiences and a wide range of background in the teaching of language and reading and spelling and writing and coding and decoding. And so we really committed to trying to pull everyone in and get everyone on the same page about what are some of those foundational pieces. I think there was a comment in there about one of the particular resources then we've gone on to choose. And it's important to remember that MTSS is thinking about providing educators with a wide range of tools and resources that they can use, because not every program, not every strategy is appropriate for every learner or works with every learner. And so we have brought in other trainers over the years, and I've seen some of those mentioned in there, whether or not it was wired for reading or others. And we have different teachers who are trained in those strategies as well. So it's about trying to fit in a number of different resources with our educators, but ultimately it's the professional development they have to be able to make the right decision to use the right strategy with students at the right time.
I'll layer into what Fred said about, the reason that we selected letters. Letters is based in the reading science research. It's not just a program that was developed. There are lots of things out there everything is to some degree based in that research, but not necessarily as deeply as we would love, right? So not all materials are based in that research either. But letters is the foundation for teachers to work from. As much as we'd like to think that colleges provide this depth of knowledge and understanding to teachers, it doesn't always. So we want to ensure that we give them a great foundation to work from and add to for those who are veteran teachers who've already got a great deal of knowledge. When we think about curriculum programs that are available that we don't necessarily have as a whole system, but will have access to, keeping in mind that any material that's been developed alongside or in thinking about the science of reading research, then that is something that we're you'll see sort of common strands in each of those things. So, those Orton Gillingham strategies are infused in a lot of the other programs that exist out there. It's not just Orton Gillingham based. It's not just Wired for Reading based. A lot of those programs provide a specific twist on their strategy, and that's what makes them their programs. So same thing with our program, Mondo. So as we think about upcoming webinar series, I'll have to work with different folks for each one of these. So the dates will be selected, and we'll do the same thing we've done with this one, which is to send out the information. But just to give you a heads up of the ones that are planned at the moment, we are going to have the next one will be really about understanding dyslexia and other reading difficulties. So that'll be more with our psychologists. I'll be working alongside one of them. And as a trainer myself, I'll be working through and adding and infusing in some of the brain research that we know about as trainers. In webinar 3, we'll talk about what was the letters training that teachers received. So what kinds of things does that cover, so that you can get a sense of that. And that'll really give you a great deal of basic knowledge about the research that has happened over the last 40 or 50 years. Webinar 4 is just parent resource intended. So how to help your child reading at home, what kinds of things can you do to support your child. Will be about understanding your progress, your child. So oftentimes you'll those sort of high stakes assessments as a part of your conversations with teachers, but we'll talk about what we give and what is available to you. And then the last one will be about process review. So what is the process the district will embark on as we go through this obligation to meet the law, but more importantly, the obligation to meet the needs of our kids. So we'll go through sort of what does that look like as a system. Did you want to add anything, Fred?
No, I think that's a great overview as we continue to try to build partnerships and grow as educational practitioners, as well as grow as a system to meet the needs of students. I know as a parent on the other end myself, with a student who is in special education, that it's a lot of different components. I'm not in the Mercer Island School District as a parent. We live in a different school district, but I know that it takes a number of different people all working together, and I know that there are shortcomings certainly in the district that I'm in, and we continue to try to partner as parents and support their systems and structures as we try to support Devin. So I know some of the commentary in there. I certainly understand where they're coming from with some of their questions.
So this webinar was really intended to be sort of the history of where we've gone, where we are, and sort of where we're going. And then each of the future webinars is more about sort of those specific elements of it. Certainly, we hope that you'll add in to the questions box if there are any topics that you'd like us to explore. We would love for you to drop those in the chat, because that will help us in planning or things you are wondering more about. Beth or Fred, are there any additional questions that we might answer this evening? Or
I'll start with one, and Beth, maybe you can synthesize some of the others in there, but some of it, one of the recommendations when we were working with the practitioners who came in to do the review is they said, you have a number of different, at the time, you have a number of different tier 1 curricula in place. And so at one school, West Mercer, there was, some things had kind of happened and people were bringing things back from conferences. And then you went to Lake Ridge and maybe it was a little different. And they really said, in order for you to really think about your tier 2 and your tier 3, you have to make sure you know what tier 1 is and isn't doing. And so that's really where we went out and really reviewed many different options. And so Nova, do you want to talk a little bit about why Mondo, particularly? I think there was a question around some of the phonological awareness and some of those early literacy skills that it builds upon from kindergarten all the way through 5th grade that all students get.
Yeah, so we underwent a pretty big process for that. The review itself, in terms of the state of affairs as it was before we adopted, happened relatively quickly in the sense that teachers recognized that our materials weren't necessarily unified and they weren't getting precisely what they needed. So we came to the pretty quick conclusion that we wanted to delve more deeply in what was out there and what was available to us. So we embarked on doing a request for proposals. And so a lot of assessment, or excuse me, a lot of curriculum companies came to us and said, here's our tool. We'd love for you to adopt it. And we had one iteration where we reviewed everything initially. We had some non-negotiables. If it does not have phonics instruction and foundational learning, then we're not even going to embark on looking at it. So we did have a great deal of review processes there. And so that we went through, we evaluated each of those, and anything that didn't fit the bill with our non-negotiables, we weeded out immediately. The things that made it through there went through another pretty intensive review with our full adoption team. And that full adoption team evaluated things on multiple occasions. So they reviewed them first with a quick glance rubric to just sort of make sure that they had everything, make sure that the initial team didn't miss anything that the curriculum might be missing. And then we moved forward with our next round, and our next round involved presentations, Q&A, opportunities for teachers to ask questions to the companies about what was available to them. And it was, what was really fantastic to watch in the process is a lot of times, companies have these bells and whistles that sound really exciting and very easy to use and implement. And our teachers were not having it. And so that was really fun to watch. But they used those rubrics and they identified Mondo in particular. We were between two at the time. And the reason that they identified Mondo was largely because it had all of the pieces that they wanted. I think it's important to say that no curriculum is perfect. I have seen lots of different tools. I have been to other districts where I have seen lots of tools, and no curriculum is perfect. So in the same vein, Mondo is not perfect. I saw in perusing the chat, one of the things referenced is the 3Q and queuing system in the balanced literacy practice. We don't even in our district really refer to it as balanced literacy. We refer to it as comprehensive literacy. You see that sort of shadow of 3 queuing systems in lots and lots of curriculum these days. And Mondo is really no exception to that. Although it is done a little bit differently to permit sort of the more comprehensive view of literacy. That said, that's where professional learning comes in to play. It's really important that we teach teachers why 3 queuing is not as functional as other methods of teaching. And so we have done a lot of work with that. It is part of the letters professional learning in thinking about the 3 queuing system. And for those who are out there who are unfamiliar with it, that's more of a whole language based approach to reading. So Mondo had so many of the things that we wanted in that oral language and phonics and reading bit that it felt like the right program for us at that time. Does that cover it, Fred?
It does. I think it does. Beth or Hannah, do you have a question? Or I think I've synthesized another, but go ahead.
Yeah, so one of them that's coming up is talking about how do we monitor progress? How do we get to screen all kids? One question came from middle school is how do we screen middle schoolers? So it sounds more like just talking about that MTSS process, the data review and things like that, which teachers and teams do all the time. So, but Nova, do you want to sink into that a little bit?
Yeah, I can address some of it, and then I don't know if either of you want to say anything. These webinars are really focused on elementary, and one of the things I saw in there too, Beth, was the idea of could Mondo be applied to students in the middle school who are struggling? The answer is yes and no. And so, Fred iterated this earlier when he said that no one thing works for every kid, right? So we're now in a place where our students have sort of worked through Mondo in our materials. And if they haven't gotten to a place where, or they are still continuing to struggle, that maybe Mondo's not the thing for them. Maybe they need something else. Now, could our teachers pull in Mondo as needed? Sure. The system at the secondary level is entirely different. I know that we're having conversations with middle and high school both about how do we make sure that we're supporting these kids as well. But it looks very different at the middle and high school for so many different reasons. Not the least of which is that the systems themselves are set differently. In elementary, we have a singular teacher managing the students and their reading abilities. And then in middle school and high school, it really becomes more of a secondary model where they have an English class and they have a history class. And secondary teachers are not taught to be teachers of reading. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be. It just means that is the system we live in our country and colleges. So do we have work to do there? Absolutely. Will we work toward that? Absolutely. I'm just not sure I can promise a date and time for that work. Did you want to add to that, Fred, or?
No, I think that we started, I think we started with putting in our benchmark assessments. And so I'll just talk a little bit about that because there were some good questions there. Prior to several years ago, we weren't even screening students on a regular basis. And now we are benchmark screening our elementary students. We have a fall benchmark period, a winter, and a spring. And then we have a different cadence depending on how students are performing on those assessments and moving through. But that really gets to, I think, the question that had just popped up around early intervention for preschool and kindergarten. And I even see some of our early learning educators on here, our kindergarten and first grade teachers. But it really is, there was a thinking in time, especially going back, a decade ago, even a little less, that we don't want to assess students too soon in kindergarten. It'll ruin their self-esteem, or we don't know enough. And the case now is assess the students right away, figure out where they're strong and where they're weak, and start intervening and supporting learners now. So it really is about, as soon as we enter into kindergarten, starting some of those interventions. But I think, to your point, as we build this and build it up, it will go into our upper elementary as we're doing, and then into the middle and high school. The Mondo, though, was meant to be K-8, so that our students could be getting a more solid foundation in, as you said, comprehensive literacy, which gets into the shared reading experiences and the read aloud experiences that aren't just reading to students, but also working on those oral language development skills, and some of the other discrete skills, thinking about phonics intervention all the way through 5th grade, rather than, well, if they haven't gotten phonics by kindergarten and first grade, because that's where it should be taught, then we stop. And making that available was really important in what we were doing. I kind of synthesized another one there. I think it's really about the training process that you and Amy Batliner-Gillette, the principal at Northwood, and our coaches went through. I mean, I think there's some questions about the expertise in the delivery of the training. Can you just speak a little bit about that?
Sorry, can you say that again? I missed that.
Yep. So in terms of you and Amy Batliner-Gillette, the principal at Northwood, some of our coaches, learning support teachers have gone to work with the Sopris West trainers through letters. Maybe talk a little bit about that process and what you've been able to bring back. I preface that with, our strategy was not to be dependent upon an outside agency or an outside entity to always have to send trainers to us, or we pay for that. It was, how can we build the capacity of people in our school district so that when we have new teachers coming in, or we wanted to train at a different sequence, we weren't dependent upon Sopris West and letters, but we'd have our own people. But if you can talk about it.
Yeah. So one of the things, Amy Batliner-Gillette, that Fred spoke of, she's been doing this for a very long time. She's been training in letters for, I think, 13 years. I have been doing it for, I believe, 6 now. And then both of us are qualified as national trainers through that company. So as a part of our work with that company as national trainers, we get to collaborate with other national trainers and authors. So we regularly get to connect with people like Louisa Moats, Dr. Carol Tolman, and we have had some sessions. These are these nerd out moments for myself as I get to go see, Dr. Kilpatrick and Michael Hagerty and all of these really big names that I otherwise probably wouldn't get to exchange conversation with. One of the most recent that we had was a conversation between two researchers around phonemic awareness and, where does that fit in the grand scheme of things and amount of time that should be really invested and spent on that. And so what I'm loving about that work and what I love that it brings to the district is that we're capable of bringing that information at the forefront of the research back to the system in the district. And that's a really valuable thing for our kids and our teachers and our trainers. We trained 3 additional staff members, as Fred talked about. 2 of them are coaches, and one of them is one of our LSP teachers who's been doing this for a while as well. And we did that for longevity purposes, really. When we think about people who stay in districts longer, it's the teachers who stay in districts longer, or the people with those coaching positions, as opposed to administrators. So, as a system, and one of the things I really appreciate about Fred as a leader is that he thinks about longevity and how can we make sustainability in the system so that it doesn't fall apart when the singular person who's managing the process leaves. And so that's been our goal all along, is to make sure that we have a plan for continued professional learning for teachers so that we can maintain that knowledge for them and we can pull them in when we need to if there are new topics that emerge or new challenges that emerge that we need to deal with. So we have a little cadre of coaches now and trainers that we get together pretty regularly to talk about the trainings that we're doing in preparation for those trainings. As trainers, local or national, we're required to do regular professional learning as a part of that. And then we have monthly cohorts. Amy and I have monthly cohorts with Dr. Tolman and Louisa Motes as the leads of that. So we have pretty regular connection there in our learning. And so our learning is continuing. I saw some commentary about the experts. And I think what's important to note is that people can be well researched and participate in that learning and well engaged in that learning, but that learning is ongoing and developing. Even though we know the foundation for reading research is actually really steady, there's continued learning there. So I think that we have access to all of that and we have the ability to put that together for our teachers and teams. Anything else you wanted to ask?
No, I would just say, as we approach the end of our time tonight, want to thank everyone for participating and being here. As we said, we have recorded this for others to watch, should they want to do so. We'll also take some of the chat and think about how to infuse that into those upcoming webinars and maybe tweak some of our original thinking so that we can maybe answer some of the questions in greater detail, especially as we bring in some of our teachers, some of our learning support specialists, psychologists, and others. So we really intended this night to, as Nova said, to really launch us out there, make sure that we're connecting with community. It's wonderful that we saw, I think at one point, nearly 40 people who wanted to join tonight. Lets us know that we have parents who are interested, we have community members who are interested, and we have educators that I saw tonight. So I want to thank everyone for showing up. I want to thank you, Nova, for putting this together, and Beth for coming alongside tonight, and Hannah, I know she's been in and out. So thank you so much for being here and have a wonderful night.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.